Two helicopters crossed the Syrian border in total darkness, carrying some of the most experienced special operations soldiers in the world. The mission was supposed to last minutes. The intelligence picture looked precise, the target isolated, the compound surrounded by farmland far from any organized defense. But as the aircraft approached the landing zone, the situation began to unravel. The objective was not hiding in a fortress deep inside ISIS territory. He was hiding in a crowded corner of northwest Syria, surrounded by armed men, civilians, and a maze of buildings that could turn a raid into a disaster in seconds. And the target was not just another militant commander. He was the most wanted terrorist leader on the planet. This was the operation that would end the life of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. In the autumn of 2019, the map of the Middle East looked very different from what it had been just 5 years earlier. In 2014, the organization calling itself the Islamic State had shocked the world. Fighters swept across large sections of Iraq and Syria with startling speed, capturing major cities and declaring the creation of a new caliphate. At the center of that declaration stood one man: Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. From the pulpit of the great mosque of Mosul, dressed in black robes and speaking calmly into a microphone, he announced the rebirth of what he called an Islamic State. In that moment he transformed from a shadowy insurgent leader into the symbolic head of a transnational jihadist movement. At its height, the territory controlled by ISIS stretched across an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom. Millions of civilians lived under its rule. Oil fields, military bases, and entire cities fell under the organization's authority. Foreign fighters poured in from across the world. But by 2017, that territorial empire was collapsing. Coalition forces led by the United States, supported by Iraqi security forces and Kurdish militias, began systematically dismantling the organization's hold over the region. City after city that had once flown the black flag of ISIS fell after months of brutal urban warfare. Mosul fell first after one of the largest urban battles of the 21st century. Then Raqqa, the de facto capital of the caliphate in Syria, was reduced to rubble during months of fighting between ISIS and the Syrian Democratic Forces backed by coalition air power. The caliphate that had once claimed vast stretches of territory was shrinking rapidly. But the collapse of ISIS territory created a new problem. Its leadership disappeared. Instead of ruling cities, senior figures within the organization began operating in secrecy. Safe houses replaced headquarters. Couriers replaced electronic communications. Command structures fractured into smaller cells designed to survive in hiding. And above all of them was Baghdadi. For intelligence agencies across the world, finding him became one of the most important counterterrorism objectives of the decade. But that task was far more difficult than many people realized. Unlike conventional military leaders, Baghdadi did not move with large security convoys or identifiable command posts. Years of insurgent warfare had taught ISIS leaders how to survive against technologically superior enemies. They avoided mobile phones. They avoided digital communication. Messages were carried by trusted couriers moving between safe houses across Iraq and Syria. Sometimes weeks passed between transmissions. From an intelligence perspective, this created a nightmare. Modern surveillance systems are designed to intercept signals, phone calls, radio traffic, satellite communications. But Baghdadi's network relied heavily on human movement and personal trust rather than electronics. The most advanced surveillance platforms in the world could watch a city from above and still miss a man traveling in the back of a civilian vehicle. And that was exactly the strategy ISIS leadership relied upon. By 2018, analysts across multiple intelligence agencies began to believe that Baghdadi had adopted a pattern of extreme operational security. He rarely stayed in the same place for long. Safe houses were used briefly and abandoned. Even within ISIS, only a very small number of individuals knew his exact location at any given time. But the search continued. And slowly, piece by piece, a pattern began to emerge. The first clues did not come from satellites or drones. They came from people. Captured ISIS members provided fragments of information during interrogations. Some spoke about couriers who carried messages between senior leaders. Others described logistical networks that supplied safe houses with food, fuel, and money. Individually, these details meant very little. But intelligence analysis rarely works through single dramatic discoveries. It works through accumulation. Thousands of small fragments of information are collected, compared, and analyzed until patterns begin to appear. And those patterns pointed in an unexpected direction. By late 2018 and early 2019, several intelligence assessments suggested that Baghdadi might no longer be hiding in the deserts of eastern Syria or western Iraq where many analysts initially believed he would remain. Instead, the evidence began pointing toward northwestern Syria. This was a surprising possibility. The region was crowded with armed groups, rival militias, and millions of civilians displaced by years of war. It was also an area where ISIS influence had once been relatively limited compared to other parts of Syria. But that may have been precisely the reason it offered concealment. In the chaos of multiple armed factions operating in close proximity, a small network could move quietly. Still, suspicion was not enough. Before any military operation could even be considered, intelligence agencies needed confirmation. They needed to know exactly where the target was hiding. And that process would take months of patient surveillance. Local sources began reporting unusual movements connected to individuals believed to be linked with ISIS logistics networks. Vehicles arrived at isolated compounds at irregular hours. Supplies were delivered quietly. Certain buildings were occupied by individuals who rarely left and avoided contact with neighbors. Drones conducted discreet surveillance over suspected areas. Analysts studied the movements of couriers believed to be trusted members of Baghdadi's inner circle. Every detail was examined. Every movement logged. Every possibility debated. Because the stakes were enormous. Launching a raid based on incorrect intelligence could result in civilian casualties, diplomatic consequences, or the escape of the very target the mission was designed to capture. So the search continued. Gradually the intelligence picture narrowed to a specific compound in the countryside near the village of Bari Shah in northwestern Syria. It was a modest structure surrounded by walls and farmland. At first glance, nothing about it appeared extraordinary. But the patterns surrounding it were unusual. People entered the compound, but rarely left. Certain individuals associated with ISIS networks were observed traveling to the area. And over time, analysts began to suspect something extraordinary. The most wanted man in the world might be hiding inside that building. But suspicion was not enough. Before any decision could be made, intelligence agencies needed certainty. And obtaining that certainty would require one of the most complex intelligence efforts of the entire war against ISIS. Because somewhere inside the tangled networks of couriers, safe houses, and hidden communications was the final clue that would reveal Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's location. By early 2019, the territorial defeat of ISIS was nearly complete. The last fragments of the so-called caliphate were collapsing under pressure from multiple directions. In eastern Syria, the final ISIS strongholds along the Euphrates River were surrounded by coalition-backed forces. In Iraq, security operations continued to hunt the remaining insurgent cells hiding in desert valleys and rural towns. But defeating ISIS on the battlefield had never been the same thing as destroying the organization. The group had already begun transforming itself back into something it understood very well. An underground insurgency. Instead of defending cities, ISIS fighters now operated in small mobile cells. Command structures were decentralized. Orders moved slowly through trusted intermediaries rather than direct communication. It was a system designed for survival. And at the center of it all remained Baghdadi. For coalition planners, this created a serious problem. The physical territory of ISIS could be eliminated. Training camps could be destroyed. Supply lines could be disrupted. But as long as Baghdadi remained alive and free, the symbolic center of the organization still existed. His authority gave legitimacy to the network. Messages attributed to him continued to circulate among supporters. Propaganda outlets still referenced his leadership. Even as ISIS lost ground, his survival allowed the movement to claim that the struggle was not over. And that was the real danger. Because history had shown repeatedly that extremist organizations could recover after military defeat if their leadership structure survived intact. Al-Qaeda itself had demonstrated this after the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001. ISIS appeared to be attempting the same transition. But the situation on the ground made locating Baghdadi extraordinarily difficult. After the fall of Mosul and Raqqa, the traditional intelligence methods that had once tracked ISIS activity became less effective. When the organization controlled cities, its networks produced a large amount of detectable activity. Vehicles moved in convoys. Communications flowed through identifiable channels. Supply chains operated openly. All of this created signals that intelligence agencies could track. But when the organization disappeared into small covert networks, those signals vanished. Instead of a government controlling territory, ISIS became a series of hidden connections between individuals scattered across multiple regions. And this is where the real challenge began. Because the coalition now faced an enemy that had spent years learning how to avoid the very technologies designed to track it. Baghdadi and his closest associates understood that electronic communication could betray their location. Mobile phones were rarely used. Internet connections were avoided. Radio transmissions were limited or eliminated entirely. Messages moved through human couriers. Trusted individuals who physically carried information between locations. It was slower. But it was far harder to intercept. And this meant that intelligence agencies had to change their approach. Instead of searching directly for Baghdadi, they began focusing on the people around him. Couriers. Logistical facilitators. Financial intermediaries. Drivers. Anyone who might have a reason to travel between safe houses connected to the senior leadership of ISIS. But even this approach carried enormous difficulty. The individuals closest to Baghdadi were extremely cautious. Many had years of experience in insurgent warfare and counter-surveillance. They understood that being followed could expose the entire network. Routes were changed frequently. Meetings were arranged through intermediaries. Locations were abandoned at the first hint of suspicion. And yet, despite these precautions, small mistakes eventually occur in every clandestine system. One courier travels slightly farther than expected. One vehicle appears repeatedly in different locations. One trusted associate begins interacting with a network already under observation. And slowly, patiently, analysts begin connecting the dots. Across multiple intelligence agencies, teams worked through enormous volumes of information. Interrogations of captured ISIS fighters produced fragments of names and relationships. Surveillance operations monitored the movements of individuals suspected of belonging to Baghdadi's inner circle. Drone footage was reviewed frame by frame. Financial transactions were examined. Local informants provided reports from villages and towns scattered across Syria and Iraq. Individually, each piece of information was incomplete. But when combined, they began to reveal something important. Several individuals connected to Baghdadi's network were moving toward the same region. Northwestern Syria. This raised immediate questions. The area was not traditionally associated with ISIS leadership. Instead, it was controlled by a complex mixture of armed factions, including groups hostile to ISIS itself. From a distance, the decision seemed counterintuitive. Why would the leader of ISIS hide in territory dominated by rival organizations? But the more analysts examined the possibility, the more it began to make sense. The region was chaotic. Control shifted between different factions. Millions of civilians displaced by years of war lived in crowded towns and villages. Movement through the countryside was constant. In such an environment, a small network operating quietly could disappear among the population. And this is where the situation became even more complicated. Because northwestern Syria was also an area where multiple international actors maintained military presence or influence. Turkish forces operated along parts of the border. Syrian government forces controlled nearby territory. Various rebel groups maintained their own checkpoints and defensive positions. Any operation conducted in that environment would require extremely careful planning. But at this stage, planners were not yet thinking about raids. They were still trying to answer a more basic question. Was Baghdadi really there? The evidence was intriguing but incomplete. Analysts continued studying the movements of several key couriers believed to have direct contact with ISIS senior leadership. One of those couriers became particularly important. He moved carefully. He avoided predictable patterns. But over time, surveillance revealed something unusual. His journeys repeatedly led toward a small rural area near the Turkish border. A place few analysts had previously considered a likely hiding location for the leader of ISIS. What happened next would become the breakthrough that intelligence agencies had been waiting for. Because someone inside Baghdadi's network had made a decision that would ultimately expose one of the most carefully hidden men in the world. And once that decision was made, the hunt entered its final phase. For years, intelligence agencies had been chasing shadows. Reports placed Baghdadi in the deserts of western Iraq. Other sources insisted he was hiding somewhere along the Syrian-Iraqi border. Occasionally a rumor surfaced claiming he had crossed into Turkey, or vanished into the mountains of northern Syria. None of these reports could be confirmed. And yet, something strange was happening inside the intelligence picture. By mid-2019, analysts reviewing the growing body of surveillance data began noticing patterns that did not fit the assumptions many commanders had been working with for years. Several couriers believed to be connected to ISIS senior leadership were moving repeatedly toward a region where the organization had almost no visible presence. Northwestern Syria. On paper, it made very little sense. The area around Idlib province was dominated by rival armed factions, many of them openly hostile to ISIS. These groups had fought violent battles against ISIS fighters in earlier years. Some of them actively hunted ISIS cells operating inside their territory. Hiding the leader of ISIS in that environment seemed almost impossible. But that contradiction was precisely what began attracting the attention of intelligence analysts. Because in counterterrorism operations, unexpected patterns often signal something important. And the more closely analysts examined the movements of certain individuals, the more that contradiction deepened. One particular courier drew increasing scrutiny. He was believed to be part of Baghdadi's trusted logistical network, an individual responsible for moving messages, money, and supplies between safe houses. Unlike ordinary ISIS members, couriers connected to the leadership rarely interacted with large groups or participated in combat operations. Their value was discretion. And this man was extremely careful. He rarely used electronic devices. His travel routes changed frequently. Vehicles were switched regularly. At times he disappeared completely from observation for weeks. But every time he resurfaced, his movements eventually pointed toward the same region. The countryside near the Turkish border in northwestern Syria. What happened next surprised everyone. Because this courier was not being tracked only through aerial surveillance. He was also being watched through human intelligence. Local sources operating inside the region began reporting unusual activity connected to a secluded compound near the small village of Barisha. The building itself was unremarkable, surrounded by agricultural land and simple rural structures. But the behavior of its occupants was unusual. The residents avoided interaction with neighbors. Visitors arrived irregularly and stayed for short periods. Supplies were delivered in ways designed to avoid attention. From the outside, it looked less like an ordinary residence and more like a location being deliberately concealed. At first, the reports were treated cautiously. Rural Syria was full of compounds where armed men lived quietly, avoiding outside contact. In a region fragmented by years of war, strange behavior alone was not evidence of anything extraordinary. But when analysts compared those local reports with the courier's movements, the situation became far more interesting. Because the courier had been observed traveling toward that same area more than once. And that was when the mystery deepened. The compound itself did not appear to belong to ISIS. Instead, intelligence suggested it was located in territory controlled by groups affiliated with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an organization that had previously fought against ISIS forces. This created a baffling possibility. The leader of ISIS might be hiding in territory dominated by his enemies. From a strategic perspective, it was almost paradoxical. But when intelligence officers examined the idea more closely, it began to make a disturbing kind of sense. Because the one place no one would expect Baghdadi to hide was among hostile factions who believed he would never dare to enter their territory. And this is where the story took a decisive turn. Over time, intelligence sources began narrowing their focus on a small group of individuals believed to have direct access to Baghdadi's inner circle. Among them was someone whose cooperation would prove critical. Through a combination of surveillance, interrogation, and covert intelligence work, coalition agencies managed to obtain detailed information about the structure of Baghdadi's security network. And eventually, they gained access to someone inside that network. Someone who knew the location of the safe houses. Someone who understood the movement patterns of Baghdadi's couriers. Someone who could describe the layout of the compound where he was believed to be hiding. The information that source provided changed everything. For the first time in years, intelligence agencies were no longer chasing rumors. They were building a precise picture. The compound in Barisha was not just another suspected safe house. It was very likely the hiding place of the leader of ISIS. But identifying the location was only the beginning. Because confirming Baghdadi's presence required even more surveillance. Drones monitored the compound for weeks. Analysts studied every movement inside the walls. Vehicles entering and leaving the property were tracked. Patterns of daily activity were recorded and analyzed. Every detail mattered. Because launching a raid against the wrong target would not only risk civilian casualties, it could allow Baghdadi to disappear again, perhaps for years. So the intelligence community moved carefully. They needed confirmation. They needed certainty. And slowly, as the surveillance continued, the evidence grew stronger. The movements of couriers. The behavior of the compound's occupants. The reports from human sources. Together they formed a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Somewhere inside that quiet rural compound, the most wanted man in the world was hiding. And once that realization reached the highest levels of military command, the nature of the mission changed completely. Because the hunt for Baghdadi was no longer an intelligence operation. It was about to become a military one. The operation that would eventually lead to Baghdadi could not rely on speed alone. It required a method. For nearly 2 decades, counterterrorism forces had refined a system designed specifically for missions like this, operations where the enemy was hidden, cautious, and protected by layers of secrecy. At the center of that system was a partnership between intelligence agencies and special operations units. Neither could succeed alone. Intelligence could identify patterns, track couriers, and analyze surveillance data. But intelligence alone could not capture or eliminate a target hiding behind walls and armed guards. And special operations forces, no matter how skilled, could not strike a target they could not find. The entire process depended on integration. And this is where the doctrine behind modern counterterrorism operations becomes visible. Instead of searching directly for the leader of a network, intelligence agencies focus on the network itself. Every clandestine organization relies on support systems. Messengers carry information. Drivers move personnel between locations. Logistics specialists arrange food, fuel, and security. Money flows through trusted intermediaries. These individuals form the connective tissue of the network. Remove one piece, and another must appear to replace it. Track enough of these pieces, and eventually they begin to point toward the center. This method had already proven effective during earlier phases of the war against ISIS and al-Qaeda. Analysts sometimes described it as dismantling an organization one link at a time. The approach was patient, deliberate, and relentless. Because every captured courier produced new information. Every seized phone or laptop revealed new names. Every document recovered during a raid exposed additional relationships. Over time, these fragments built a map of the entire network. And that map revealed something critical. Baghdadi's security system depended on a very small circle of trusted individuals. Unlike conventional military leaders who move with large staffs and security units, Baghdadi relied on secrecy more than force. Only a handful of people knew his exact location at any given time. That small circle became the focus of the intelligence effort. Some were captured during operations in Iraq and Syria. Others were identified through surveillance. One courier in particular proved extremely important. For months, intelligence agencies monitored his movements carefully. He avoided electronic communication, traveled irregularly, and frequently changed vehicles. But he still had a mission. And that mission eventually led him toward the same region again and again. Northwestern Syria. But that wasn't the real breakthrough. The real breakthrough came from human intelligence. Someone inside Baghdadi's network began cooperating with coalition intelligence services. The reasons behind that decision remain classified, but the effect was immediate. For the first time, analysts received direct descriptions of the compound where Baghdadi was believed to be hiding. The source described the layout of the buildings, the security precautions used by the guards, the routes taken by couriers arriving at the location. Even small details, such as the internal rooms and possible escape tunnels. Information like this was priceless. Because aerial surveillance could show analysts where a building stood and how vehicles approached it. But it could not show what waited behind the walls. Human sources filled that gap. And what they revealed confirmed that the compound in Barisha was not an ordinary residence. It had been modified. High outer walls surrounded the buildings. Movement inside the compound was tightly controlled. Certain areas were restricted even to members of the security team. And most importantly, the source confirmed that Baghdadi had been present there. But confirmation alone was not enough. Before any operation could be approved, intelligence agencies had to verify the information through multiple independent methods. Drone surveillance continued around the compound. Vehicles arriving at the location were photographed and tracked. Thermal imaging systems monitored movement patterns inside the walls. Analysts compared every detail provided by the human source with what aerial sensors observed. The two pictures began aligning. This process, known within intelligence circles as pattern of life analysis, is one of the most important tools in modern counterterrorism operations. Instead of looking for a single moment of proof, analysts study how people behave over time. When do they leave buildings? How long do visitors stay? Where do vehicles travel after departing? What routines repeat day after day? Patterns reveal identity. A courier who visits once might mean nothing. But a courier who returns repeatedly, always at night, always entering through the same gate, begins to tell a story. And the story emerging from Barisha was becoming clearer. A small number of carefully controlled visitors. Security behavior consistent with protecting a high-value individual. Restricted movement inside the compound. All of it pointed toward a single conclusion. But there was one final challenge. The compound was located in a densely populated region filled with civilians and rival armed groups. Conducting a large military assault could easily create chaos. Gunfire might draw fighters from nearby militias. Civilians could be caught in the crossfire. And worst of all, Baghdadi might escape through tunnels or hidden exits before the assault team reached him. The mission therefore required absolute precision. A force capable of entering the compound quickly, isolating the target, and controlling the entire area before anyone outside could react. And that meant the operation would fall to one of the most experienced special operations organizations in the world. Joint Special Operations Command. Within JSOC, units trained specifically for high-risk raids against heavily protected targets. Their missions often take place deep inside hostile territory, far from conventional military support. Speed, surprise, and coordination are everything. But even for these units, the operation against Baghdadi presented unusual risks. The compound sat inside territory influenced by multiple armed groups. The raid force would have to fly across contested airspace. Helicopters might be detected. Enemy fighters could respond before the team completed the mission. Every minute would matter. And this is where the doctrine behind such operations becomes decisive. The assault team would not simply storm the compound. The entire mission would unfold according to a carefully choreographed sequence. Aircraft would approach under cover of darkness. Electronic surveillance would monitor the surrounding region. Ground teams would isolate the target compound within seconds of landing. And once inside, they would move directly toward the individual believed to be hiding there. The goal was not a prolonged firefight. The goal was speed. Because if the intelligence was correct, the target inside that compound was not just another militant commander. He was the man who had once declared himself the leader of a global jihadist state. And after years of searching, the coalition finally believed they knew exactly where he was hiding. All that remained was the most dangerous part of the entire mission. Going in and getting him. The helicopters lifted off under a moonless sky. Inside them sat the assault force chosen for the most sensitive counterterrorism mission of the year, operators from one of the United States' most elite special operations units, flying deep into northwestern Syria. The target lay more than an hour away. The aircraft moved low across the terrain, following a route carefully designed to avoid radar and reduce the chance of detection. The flight path crossed airspace controlled by multiple armed factions and foreign militaries. Every kilometer of that route had been negotiated, analyzed, and rehearsed. Because if anything went wrong in the air, the entire mission could collapse before it even began. But that wasn't the most dangerous part. The real danger waited on the ground. The compound in Barisha sat inside a region crowded with armed groups, smugglers, displaced civilians, and rival militias. If the helicopters were spotted, word could spread quickly through the villages surrounding the objective. A firefight could escalate within minutes. And the mission depended entirely on surprise. Inside the aircraft, the assault teams reviewed the final details. Every operator knew the layout of the compound from hours of surveillance imagery and intelligence briefings. They had memorized entry points, walls, internal buildings, and the possible location of escape tunnels. They also knew something else. The target had a reputation. Baghdadi had spent years avoiding capture. Intelligence reports suggested he rarely traveled without loyal guards and had contingency plans designed specifically to prevent being taken alive. This meant the assault team had to move quickly. The helicopters approached the landing zone just before midnight. Then the mission accelerated. As the aircraft descended toward the compound, loudspeakers began broadcasting warnings in Arabic, instructing anyone inside the buildings to surrender. This step was part of standard procedure designed to encourage non-combatants to exit before the assault began. Several individuals emerged from the compound. Women and children were escorted away from the structure by the operators. But others remained inside. And this is where the operation became violent. Gunfire erupted from within the compound as the assault team began breaching the outer defenses. ISIS fighters guarding the location opened fire, attempting to slow the advance. The operators responded immediately. Within seconds, the outer perimeter of the compound was secured. Assault teams moved through the walls and into the buildings using controlled explosive charges and mechanical breaching tools. The goal was speed. Every second mattered. Because the intelligence reports had warned of something critical. The compound contained a tunnel system. If Baghdadi reached those tunnels before the operators reached him, he could disappear into the surrounding countryside before the team had time to react. So the assault teams pushed forward rapidly, moving from room to room inside the compound. Guards were engaged and neutralized during the advance. Other occupants surrendered. But the main objective remained somewhere deeper inside the structure. Then the operators received confirmation. Baghdadi had been spotted. He was moving quickly toward the rear of the compound. And he was not alone. According to later accounts of the operation, Baghdadi fled into an underground tunnel as the assault team closed in. With him were several children. The operators pursued him into the passage. A military working dog, trained specifically for tunnel pursuit, was sent ahead into the confined space to prevent the target from escaping. Moments later, the situation reached its final and most dramatic moment. Cornered inside the tunnel, Baghdadi detonated a suicide vest. The explosion killed him instantly and caused part of the tunnel to collapse. When the operators reached the site, the mission entered its final verification phase. Even though the explosion had destroyed much of the immediate area, the team needed absolute confirmation that the target had been killed. Biometric identification procedures began almost immediately. DNA samples were taken from the remains and compared with genetic material collected during earlier intelligence operations involving Baghdadi's family members. Within hours, the results confirmed what the assault force already suspected. The man killed in the tunnel was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The leader of ISIS was dead. But even as the assault team secured the compound and collected intelligence materials left behind inside the buildings, the mission was not yet finished. Because what happened after Baghdadi's death would prove almost as important as the raid itself. And the documents and electronic devices recovered inside the compound were about to reveal the next layer of the ISIS network. From a tactical perspective, the raid in Barisha was not a spontaneous assault. It was the culmination of a doctrine that had been refined over nearly 2 decades of counterterrorism warfare. Operations like this follow a carefully structured sequence designed to solve one central problem. How do you capture or eliminate a high-value target hiding inside hostile territory without allowing him time to escape? The answer lies in speed, isolation, and intelligence integration. The first principle is speed. In a high-value target raid, the most dangerous moment is the period between the enemy realizing an assault is underway and the assault force physically reaching the target. That window can last seconds or minutes. During that time a target may destroy intelligence materials, escape through hidden exits, trigger defensive explosives, or blend into the surrounding population. Everything about the raid is designed to compress that timeline. Aircraft fly directly to the objective instead of landing far away. Breaching teams move immediately through entry points. Internal rooms are cleared in rapid sequence by operators who have rehearsed the layout repeatedly before the mission. Every movement inside the compound follows a choreography built through training. But speed alone is not enough. The second principle is isolation. The target compound must be separated from the surrounding environment before outside forces can react. In the Barisha raid, helicopters and supporting aircraft established control over the immediate area within seconds of the assault beginning. Air assets monitored nearby roads and villages for approaching vehicles. Operators secured the outer perimeter of the compound to prevent anyone inside from escaping into nearby buildings. This isolation prevented reinforcements from arriving and ensured that the fight remained contained to a single location. Without that control, the situation could have escalated quickly. The region surrounding the compound contained multiple armed groups and rival militias. Any extended firefight could have drawn attention from forces not directly involved in the mission. So the assault force moved with deliberate urgency. The third principle is intelligence exploitation. In modern counterterrorism doctrine, the objective of a raid is not only the target. It is the information surrounding him. Documents, computers, mobile devices, handwritten notes, and digital storage media can reveal the structure of entire networks. Every safe house address, every courier contact, every financial record can lead to additional targets. This concept became widely known within special operations forces as the find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze cycle. The cycle begins with intelligence locating a target. The assault force then fixes the target's location and finishes the operation through capture or elimination. But immediately afterward comes the most important phase. Exploitation. During the Barisha raid, operators searched the compound carefully once the target had been confirmed dead. Rooms were examined for hidden materials. Electronic devices were collected. Documents were gathered. Every item that might reveal further information about ISIS leadership networks was taken. This material would later be transported to intelligence analysis centers where specialists would examine it in detail. Sometimes a single recovered phone number or email address can trigger an entirely new series of investigations. And this is where the tactical success of a raid transforms into strategic impact. Because removing a leader weakens an organization. But dismantling the network around him can cripple it. The operation against Baghdadi followed this exact logic. The death of the ISIS leader carried enormous symbolic importance. For years he had represented the authority behind the organization's claim to statehood. But the raid also targeted the structure that protected him. Couriers. Logistical facilitators. Security personnel. Documents. Recovered during the operation helped analysts map the relationships between these individuals. And this mattered because extremist organizations rarely collapse instantly when a leader is killed. They adapt. They replace leadership. They reorganize. The intelligence recovered during raids like Bari Shah helps prevent that process. It exposes hidden connections. It reveals succession plans. It identifies individuals preparing to assume leadership roles. In the weeks following the operation, intelligence analysts worked through the material collected at the compound. The goal was to understand how Baghdadi had managed to remain hidden for so long. And what parts of the ISIS network were still active. What emerged from that analysis was a clearer picture of the organization's survival strategy. Even as the caliphate collapsed, ISIS leadership had been building a decentralized structure designed to operate underground. Cells scattered across Syria and Iraq. Regional leaders operating with greater independence. Propaganda networks continuing to spread ideology even without territorial control. In other words, the raid had removed the head of the organization. But the body still existed. And this realization shaped the strategic lessons drawn from the operation. Because modern counterterrorism campaigns rarely end with a single mission. They unfold over years. Networks regenerate. Leaders emerge. New groups adopt the same ideology. The operation in Bari Shah demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of precision counterterrorism. With enough intelligence and coordination, even the most carefully hidden target can eventually be found. But eliminating a leader is only one step in a much larger struggle. And that struggle would continue long after the helicopters carrying the assault force lifted away from the compound in northern Syria. The death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi marked the end of one chapter in the war against ISIS. But it did not end the conflict itself. For years, Baghdadi had served as both the ideological and symbolic center of the organization. His declaration of the caliphate in 2014 had transformed ISIS from a regional insurgent group into a movement claiming global authority. Millions of supporters across different countries recognized him as the caliph. Removing him from the battlefield therefore carried consequences far beyond the compound in Bari Shah. Within days of the operation, ISIS confirmed his death through its own propaganda channels. At the same time, the organization attempted to demonstrate continuity. A successor was announced. The message was clear. The leadership had changed, but the movement intended to continue. This reaction revealed an important strategic reality. Modern extremist organizations are designed to survive leadership losses. ISIS had studied the history of earlier jihadist groups, particularly al-Qaeda after the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011. They understood that the removal of a single leader, even one as prominent as Baghdadi, would not automatically dismantle the network. Instead, the organization had prepared succession plans. Regional commanders had already been operating with increasing autonomy during the final years of the caliphate. Communications between leadership figures were intentionally limited, allowing cells to function even when contact with senior leaders was interrupted. This decentralized structure allowed ISIS to adapt after Baghdadi's death. But the raid still carried significant strategic impact. First, it removed a figure who had held unique symbolic authority within the movement. Baghdadi's claim to leadership was not only political but also religious. His background in Islamic scholarship and his public declaration of the caliphate had been central to ISIS propaganda. Replacing that level of legitimacy was difficult. Second, the operation demonstrated the continued reach of international counterterrorism forces. Even after years of hiding, Baghdadi had eventually been located through the combined efforts of intelligence agencies, surveillance systems, and human sources. The message sent by that success was clear. There were very few places left where senior terrorist leaders could assume permanent safety. But the strategic lesson ran deeper than that. The operation illustrated how modern counterterrorism campaigns function as long-term intelligence struggles rather than conventional battles. The defeat of ISIS territorial control had taken years of military operations across Iraq and Syria. But locating Baghdadi required something different. Patience. Interrogations of captured fighters. Surveillance of couriers. Analysis of small fragments of information gathered over months and years. None of those steps produced dramatic headlines on their own. Yet together they formed the intelligence picture that eventually led to the compound in Barisha. This pattern has repeated itself throughout modern counterterrorism. History. High-value targets rarely appear suddenly. They are discovered slowly through the accumulation of countless small clues. And this reality reveals one of the defining characteristics of modern warfare. The decisive moments, the helicopter raid, the assault on a compound, the elimination of a leader, are only the visible end of a much longer process. Behind every such mission lies years of intelligence work, surveillance, and analysis. The operation against Baghdadi followed that same pattern. The final raid lasted only a few hours. The hunt had lasted far longer. And even after the mission ended, the conflict it represented continued. ISIS did not disappear. The organization transitioned into an underground insurgency operating through smaller cells across the Middle East and beyond. Attacks continued in Iraq and Syria. Affiliates in Africa and Asia carried out operations under the ISIS banner. In that sense, the death of Baghdadi did not conclude the war. But it did mark a turning point. The man who had once stood in Mosul declaring the creation of a new caliphate had ended his life hiding in a rural compound, pursued by the very intelligence networks he had spent years trying to evade. His rise had symbolized the sudden expansion of ISIS power. His death symbolized the collapse of that state. And it served as a reminder of a fundamental truth in counterterrorism strategy. Organizations built around ideology can survive military defeat. But their leaders, no matter how carefully they hide, remain vulnerable to time, intelligence, and persistence. The compound in Barisha was silent by the time the helicopters lifted away. Moments earlier, it had been the hiding place of the most wanted man in the world. Now the buildings were empty, the target confirmed dead, and the assault force was already disappearing into the night sky above northern Syria. From the outside, the mission had lasted only a few hours. But the story behind it stretched across years of war, intelligence work, and relentless pursuit. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had once stood before cameras in Mosul declaring the birth of a caliphate that claimed millions of people and vast territory across Iraq and Syria. For a moment in history, his organization appeared unstoppable. Cities fell. Armies retreated. And the black flag of ISIS spread across the map of the Middle East. But what followed was a long and grinding reversal. The coalition campaign dismantled the territorial state piece by piece. Urban battles destroyed the cities ISIS once ruled. Fighters were killed, captured, or scattered into small underground cells. And Baghdadi himself was forced into hiding. The man who had once ruled from palaces and government buildings now moved between isolated safe houses, relying on couriers and secrecy to stay alive. But that secrecy was never perfect. Because modern counterterrorism operations are built on a simple principle. Every network leaves traces. A courier travels between two towns. A vehicle returns repeatedly to the same road. A trusted associate makes contact with someone already under surveillance. Each detail alone means almost nothing. But together they form a pattern. And patterns eventually lead somewhere. In the case of Baghdadi, they led to a quiet compound in the countryside near the Turkish border. A place chosen precisely because it seemed unlikely. A place where the leader of ISIS believed he could disappear among rival factions and millions of civilians displaced by war. But intelligence does not rely on assumptions. It relies on patience. And patience eventually closed the distance between the analysts studying fragments of information and the operators flying toward the target. The raid itself was fast. A sudden descent from the sky. A compound surrounded. Rooms cleared in seconds. A final pursuit into the darkness of a tunnel. Then an explosion that ended the life of the man who had once declared himself caliph. Yet even that moment did not close the story. Because the death of Baghdadi was never intended to end the fight against ISIS in a single night. Its true significance lay in what it represented. The operation demonstrated the reach of modern intelligence networks. It showed how years of surveillance, interrogation, and analysis could converge on a single point in space and time. And it revealed something else about the nature of modern conflict. Leaders can rise quickly in moments of chaos. They can command armies, control territory, and influence events across continents. But eventually, the same networks that allow them to operate will also expose them. The couriers they trust. The safe houses they hide within. The people who move through their world. All of it leaves a trail. And when that trail is followed long enough, even the most carefully hidden figure can be found. In October 2019, that trail ended in the tunnels beneath a rural compound in northwestern Syria. The helicopters vanished into the darkness carrying the assault force home. And with them ended the life of the man who once claimed to rule a caliphate.